3,200 years ago, some of the most sophisticated palace civilizations of the ancient world collapsed within the span of a single lifetime. Kings stopped writing to each other. Cities burned in the same generation. An entire system of writing disappeared so completely that it remained unread for more than 3,000 years. Centuries later, one story survived out of that forgotten world. Not a king's story, not a general's, but the story of a single soldier who spent 20 years trying to find his way home. In a museum in Syria today, there is a clay tablet that was never finished, never sent, and never meant to survive. A hing! The king of the city of Ugarit was writing to a neighboring ruler, warning that enemy ships were massing offshore, that his own army was away fighting somewhere else, that his city had nothing left to defend itself with. And then the fire came. The very fire the letter was warning about. And it baked the wet clay solid before anyone could stop it. Ugarit was never rebuilt. We know that surviving soldier's story today as the Odyssey. We've turned it into a swashbuckling adventure, all one-eyed giants and seductive witches. But strip the monsters away, and what's underneath is something the movies have never dared show. A portrait of what happens to human beings when the entire structure of civilization simply stops existing. Picture the scale of what Homer's original audience already understood without being told. A 10-year war, followed by another 10 years just trying to sail home. A stretch of time so vast it swallows an entire adult life. Odysseus loses every single one of his men, one by one, in front of him, eaten, drowned, turned into animals, sacrificed to gods who don't seem to care whether they live. When he finally reaches his own island, he doesn't walk through his front door as himself. He disguises himself as a beggar because some part of him no longer trusts the world enough to come home as who he actually is. That single detail should stop you. This isn't a hero swaggering back to a parade. It's a man who has learned, the way only trauma teaches, that homecoming itself might be a trap. For over a century, most historians assumed the whole story was pure invention and no more grounded in reality than the gods themselves. Then, in the 1870s, a wealthy, obsessive amateur named Heinrich Schliemann started digging into a mound in northwestern Turkey called Hizarlik, convinced Homer's Troy was buried beneath it. He was reckless, and he damaged more than he preserved, and he was still, astonishingly, right about the location. Archaeologists have since identified 9 layers of settlement stacked on top of each other, like the rings of a tree, and one of them, known as Troy's Sevenfa, shows a city violently destroyed by fire around 1180 BC, its streets choked with collapsed buildings and unburied bodies. And whether that fire was caused by the exact war Homer describes is still genuinely unresolved. What isn't in dispute is that a real wealthy walled city at that precise location was violently destroyed at roughly the moment the legend says it was. But the strangest discovery wasn't in Troy at all. It turned up hundreds of miles away, in a palace that never got the chance to finish its own warning. In 1939, archaeologist Carl Blegen was excavating a Mycenaean palace at Pylos, in Greece, a site linked in legend to King Nestor, an ally of Odysseus, in the poem, when he uncovered a room full of clay tablets, baked hard by fire, and scattered across the floor, like the pages of a diary someone dropped mid-sentence. It took another Englishman, Michael Ventris, more than a decade to crack the unknown script they were written in, a script now called Linear B. When he finally succeeded in 1952, he proved something extraordinary. This was an early form of Greek, centuries older than anyone had confirmed Greek writing to exist. And buried among the bureaucratic records of grain counts and temple offerings were tablets describing rowers being urgently sent to guard the coastline, and watch posts being manned along the shore. A kingdom bracing for an attack in what looked like its final weeks. Pylos was destroyed shortly after those tablets were written. It, too, was never rebuilt. For the first time, the legend and the ashes of a real city were telling the same story. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in the space of roughly 2 generations, the great palace civilizations collapsed almost together. The Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms, the trading cities of the Levant, all gone or gutted within decades of one another. Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu, commissioned by Ramesses III around 1175 BC, describe a mysterious coalition the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, sweeping through the region and uprooting kingdoms as they went. Historians still argue over the cause: invasion, drought, earthquake, or the collapse of the fragile trade networks that kept these societies fed and armed. But the likeliest answer is that all of it arrived at once, each crisis making the next one unsurvivable. An entire international system, kings writing to kings, ships hauling tin and copper across 1,000 miles of open sea, came apart at the seams and never fully returned. Now imagine trying to walk home through that. Not to a hero's welcome, but to a coastline of burned palaces and broken trade routes with no functioning authority left to guarantee your farm or your family was even still there. Piracy exploded across this period, precisely because there were no navies left to stop it, and no palaces left buying in bulk. Men who had been soldiers or traders simply turned raiders to eat. That is the world Homer's audience actually lived inside. Generations later, still telling stories about it. The Odyssey isn't really a fantasy about monsters. It's a folk memory of what war, dislocation, and the collapse of every institution that made a man's identity legible does to that man by the time, if ever, he makes it home. And the poem doesn't flinch from the human wreckage, even where the film adaptations quietly do. And when Odysseus finally reclaims his house, he doesn't simply embrace his family. He slaughters the suitors occupying his home, and then orders the execution of 12 of his own household's enslaved women, hanged for having been forced into relationships with those same suitors, and punished for surviving a decade of powerlessness the same way their absent king was gone, surviving his own. It's one of the most quietly disturbing scenes in ancient literature, and it was never a plot hole to be smoothed over. It was the point. In this world, homecoming doesn't restore justice. It just changes who's holding the power to hand it out. Here's where the evidence and the legend need to be pulled apart, because it's tempting to let them blur together. That Troy was a real city and violently destroyed around the time tradition claims. That's solid, excavated fact. That Mycenaean palaces like Pylos fell in the same general collapse, leaving panicked wartime records behind. Also fact. That one man named Odysseus existed, sailed past an actual cyclops, and outwitted a real witch who turned his crew into pigs. No serious historian believes that. The monsters are almost certainly what trauma looks like after being retold for 3 or 4 centuries around a fire, and long before anyone thought to write any of it down. A storm that kills half a crew becomes a sea monster. A hostile island of raiders becomes a giant with one eye. The exaggeration isn't dishonesty. It's how a culture with no writing system left preserved the emotional truth of a catastrophe long after the precise facts had eroded away. Which might be the bigger story here. Every civilization that survives a catastrophe seems to need to turn that catastrophe into a story, because raw historical fact, famine, fire, the death of half a generation of men at sea is almost impossible to hold on to directly for centuries. Myth is memory, with the unbearable parts translated into something you can actually carry. The Odyssey survived for 28 centuries, not despite its monsters and gods, but because of them. They were never a distraction from a fallen Bronze Age world. They were the only container large enough to hold what it felt like to live through its ending. Back on that coast in Ugarit, the unsent letter still sits in a museum case, baked into permanence by the very fire it was warning about. Whoever tried to send it never learned whether help arrived. There's no record. The city survived long enough to find out. Somewhere in that same collapsing world, other men were trying to get home too, men whose real, unrecorded voyages eventually hardened, like that tablet, into a story we still tell today. We remember Odysseus as the man who made it back, and what the archaeology quietly insists we not forget is how many didn't, and how much of what came home with the ones who did was never the same man who left.